Welcome to the Branding PR Podcast, where we dive deep into the stories and strategies of today's most impactful entrepreneurs, business leaders, and professionals. Whether you're building your brand, scaling your business, or just looking for inspiration, you're in the right place. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Branding PR Podcast, where we spotlight the strategies, stories, and standout voices behind powerful brands. I'm your host, Brandi Sims, PR Pro, founder of Branding PR, and your guide into the world of modern public relations. Today's guest is someone who knows the tech PR game inside and out. Scott Rosenblum is the president and founder of Level PR, a boutique agency that works closely with B2B tech startups, especially in the fintech space. With over 20 years of experience in tech PR, Scott's helped startups navigate the tricky world of media, messaging, and what we'll focus on today, timing, because there's a huge importance on timing. When should a startup really engage with PR? And what extra layers come into play for international companies looking to break into the US market? We're covering it all today. So let's jump right in. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Brandi, and thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure.
All right. The pleasure is all mine. I'm excited to have this conversation. All right. So let's kick this thing off. Can you share a bit about your PR journey and what led you to launch Level PR?
Sure. I'm happy to. Been doing public relations, been in my career for well over 20 years, but launched Level PR a little over 8 years ago. And I'd say other than the first year of my career, my everything after that has been tech related, from my early days out in Silicon Valley to coming back to New York to work mostly with ad tech clients and then eventually publishing and then into more fully the tech startup scene. I've always done some sort of component of tech. And I'd say, and particularly I'd say in the past, since the tens, it's been mostly focused on the B2B side. And in a lot of ways, what led me to starting my own firm was just sort of the right timing, in a sense, what we're talking about today. It was the right time. I had a very full career, mostly on the agency side with a little bit of corporate communications. But, I felt I took it as far as I could, working for somebody else. And it was time to parlay at that point, well over a decade of experience into, self-employment and giving the entrepreneurial thing its fair shake. And I'm happy to say it's worked out pretty well since 2017. And it's given me a chance to do something that I typically didn't have the chance to do when I worked for someone else, which is to control exactly, there's circumstances arise, but typically to control the type of clients I'm working with and the type of industries. And for me, one of my main focal points is fintech. I had my first fintech client back in 2014. I loved it, fell in love with the then nascent industry. And I made sure that when I founded Level PR, that would be something I would focus on again. And since then, I've worked with a lot of different fintech companies, as well as other B2B companies in different verticals.
Oh, yes. Well, hey, you've been rocking and rolling since 2017 and even beyond that, because we all know that just because our agency starts then doesn't mean that our expertise started then. You were doing these things way, way well beyond and before that time. So what drew you to working specifically with B2B startups and fintech companies? Was it just the industry itself, or it was just something you were working on or just had a passion for?
I found early on that even though I did some B2C tech work and B2C work in general, I just found the B2B work to be most exciting. More often than not, I found it to be interesting. Some clients, some clients are definitely going to be more interesting than others. Some tech solutions they're putting out are going to, be more revolutionary than others. But I always like the challenge of being able to, get the coverage that they wanted and get the coverage that they needed to supercharge their marketing efforts. To be a challenge, in some cases to be a challenge, but a good challenge, because in some cases it really was like I don't see where's the narrative here, or where's the differentiation, what makes this sexy or interesting. So I really did appreciate those challenges. And even when it was a little bit, even when it is a client, or was a client that had had something a little bit more interesting, at least from my perspective, there's still other challenges that would that would surface, and commingle that with working more with founders who were early on in their sort of startup journey and kind of new to PR and new to media relations. I enjoyed that challenge as well to get them up to speed, to teach them how to handle media interviews, and to teach them how to make the most of your media coverage even after the article already appears, things like that. So generally speaking, those are the things I really enjoyed about B2B, and I found the B2B world to have these sort of specific challenges. And at the same time, I just really enjoyed what I was learning about in the world of fintech, and the type of companies I was working with, and the type of challenges that they were trying to solve. That even though they might be on the back end and be providing solutions to banks and lenders and things that most people will never see, or if they do see something, they really don't know the depth of it, particularly if it's understanding how the payments world works. I still like the fact that ultimately, if it was the right fintech startup, they were providing a solution to, ultimately ease the pain of the end users, of consumers, in lots of cases, to, in some cases, be able to offer banking solutions and technologies to, the populations that it was traditionally hard for them to get those type of offers, to get loans and things like that. So working with those companies that we're not always just about the end game of just raising money from VCs or hopefully getting acquired. That actually had sort of a bigger mission and a bigger cause, if you will. I found inspiring, and I found really fascinating. And since money touches everything, I found it great that these companies existed in an industry that was really focused on this, and still is, depending, of course, on the various subsects, because there's a lot of different categories of fintech these days.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And the more that you speak about, deciding that this was going to be, your focus and target area, working with B2B startups, the more it just kind of reminds me and really enlightens me of how it makes sense, right? When you're working with B2B, it's like you speak the same language. So it definitely, it's very niche. Don't get me wrong, very niche, very specific, but it is one that I could see that the conversation, that communication would be a lot more seamless in that, we're both on the same level playing field, business to business. How are we connecting with other businesses to share this message and whatnot? So definitely, thank you for sharing that. So
Hmm.
let's get into this big question. When should a startup start PR? What's one of the most common misconceptions that startups have about when to begin PR?
Hmm. I'd say one of the most common I'd say one of the most common misperceptions would be, maybe only when you have your first notable funding round. It's typically, for a lot of the startups I've worked with, the first announcements they put out with working with Level PR, and in some cases, it's also typically the first sort of notable coverage that they've received. Ideally, if I'm doing my job, it will be will be notable when all is said and done. But it's the first time. At the least, the common denominator is that it's the first time working with a dedicated professional, a dedicated PR agency, as opposed to if they've gotten any publicity just organically without trying. That so I say that because it's okay to think about other potential milestones and other things you might reach, either before, that could be newsworthy, that could be at the right stage for said startup, that could be an opportunity to then work with an agency like myself, or work with any agency for that matter, to
Yeah.
then have a proactive campaigns, and have proactive, pitching on their behalf. It doesn't just have to start with the funding, or be only the funding, because I found that some startups, that might be the only time they really invest in that, or think in that, or start thinking in the equation of their burn rate or what funds they have. And then I tend to see that, if it happens to be a prospect I'm working with, and they've had previous coverage per se, and that previous coverage has only been for their various funding rounds, and there's nothing in between. And it makes me wonder, like, okay, this is not, especially if it's a startup that's a little further along, that
Mm,
might be right, Series A, B, or what
yeah.
have you, and there's like little to nothing in between. So you try and tell me this was the only time that your company focused on publicity, focused on getting the messaging out there in this way. Was it the only time, you either did it yourself or hired a firm like mine, or so on and so forth? So it makes me wonder, are they, is there really not that much going on? Is that the only interesting news? That maybe the cynic in me is saying that, but in other cases, it makes me wonder, maybe it's a value equation. Maybe the only time they're valuing, PR and considering it for their marketing spend is for those, highlight reel, we
Yeah.
just scored 50 million in funding moments, and not considering the rest where there might be and probably are hidden gems in between those announcements, because even
Mhm.
for a successful startup, those don't happen every day.
Mm, mm. You're so spot on with that. That's one of those major misconceptions that I think PR always gets is that, oh, it's just celebrity. It's only for celebrities or those ones that
Mhm.
have this Uber budget. And it's like not the case at all whatsoever. PR is for anyone that's in business because whether you have a team, an agency behind you, or it's simply yourself, you're constantly working your PR and it could be very good or it could be very terrible, depending on what that looks like, right? But yeah,
Mhm.
that's definitely a common misconception is that it's just only available. Oh, that's just for celebrities, or oh, that's just for when I've landed, like you mentioned before, that major client or notable client. No, we're not waiting for you to get Michael Jordan. You could be doing that well before and getting some PR support that is much needed for the success of the brand and building that awareness. So I'm glad that you spoke on that. So, are there any specific signals or milestones a startup should hit before engaging with a PR firm like
That's a
yours?
great question. That's a
Yeah.
great question. And in some cases, I will say can vary case by case, but there are certain, and I've done this enough that I've seen certain sort of common themes that tend to pop up.
Yeah.
One of them I'd say is, be careful at the same, whereas the previous question is just don't, value PR for the few times you have hard news. Think about all the softer news you might have in
Yeah.
between. The other thing to consider is, sometimes when it's too soon. Now, for a lot of startups, that's usually the typical answer is that's easy, Scott. It's when we have the money to afford you, or any agency. And I get that. If obviously, if it's, if the money's not there and, there's no need to sort of sell yourself short to maybe hire someone that you're not so engaged with, or not so, you're like your third or fourth choice just because the money is good, or their fee is way cheaper. But often with that stuff, I'm sure as you know, you get what you pay for. So the money does, the funds, the money does dictate. But often what could dictate, because sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes it could be an early stage startup that already had a killer seed round, which is not uncommon these days.
Hmm.
Um, what should help dictate for them, I find, is if it's too soon from a narrative standpoint, where money's not the factor. If the product may be fresh out of MVP, and maybe there's some early stage customers using it, but they haven't used it long enough for the startup to really show the ROI, to show how they've solved whatever pain point they're trying to solve. It's
Hmm.
just not enough. There's just not enough there yet. Or maybe that they haven't found a way to really differentiate themselves from whomever their competitors are in the market, especially if it's a market, a lot of this qualifies a lot of them these days, that has a lot of competition, or a lot of established competition. What are you bringing to the table that's so different? There are some exceptions to the rule. I've worked with early stage companies where they didn't have the funding yet. They were able to afford me, which was great. But at the same time, they actually were able to surpass, and they didn't have the clients yet either. But they were able to overcome that because what they were working on was so unique or so interesting, or a different wrinkle on something that's already out there, or they're trying a different way to do it. That alone was, I guess, there was enough juice there, if you will,
Yeah.
that was able to get the company quality coverage. But for
Mhm.
most early stage startups, it's usually not there. On the flip side, though, I find that tech startups should think about when it might be, I don't want to say too late, because it's never too late to turn it on, but
Hmm.
whether it might be if they waited a little bit too long to turn it on. And often I'll find is when they don't have that, and I understand this, most founders aren't marketing professionals or previously marketing professionals or have marketing expertise or and certainly PR expertise, but often it's when I get it on the flip side, it's, oh man, I wish you met you like 6, 7 months ago. I'm like, why? Well, we had a funding announcement, and then we announced a new partner, and we developed these new features and stuff, and we put this out, and we reached XYZ milestone. We expanded, opened up a new office, or got SOC 2 compliance, or whatever, and and it's various different hard news, announcements mixed in of various levels of interest to the media. And that could have been something that if they worked with my agency, they like
Yep.
there could have been coverage for that. Certainly the funding, and then respectively for the other announcements. And I'm like, yeah, and that's a case where we could start up now, but at the same time, you could only you can only go so far back to backwards announce certain news. Some things you can, if I was like, oh, we only launched it a month ago. I'm like, yeah, but no one's really talked about it. It's not publicly known for some of our clients know. Yeah, I could then start with you, and then we could put that
Yes.
out and see what happens. But it's just like, oh yeah, no, we did this like 8 months ago. It's what's new, and when it's too old, it's just too old, or it's already out in public, or it's an SEC filing, or maybe you put a release out. You can't undo that. You know.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, that was going to be my follow-up question for you is what happens if they do start too late? Because you've mentioned what happens when they start too early, in quotes. But really, what happens when they start too late is are we creating a new campaign or almost starting from scratch if they've we've already done all the things, but now here we are coming to you to help promote them or to promote anything.
Exactly. I think it's exactly that. At that point, when I have those situations, I think I have to, sort of start from scratch. If there is anything that is, can be back announced, hard news wise, great. But if not, really start more with the softer news and really look deeper into the narratives. And at that case, if they're, further along startup, which is usually the situation. It's then going into the case studies. Are there clients who could actually talk about the ROI they've received from whatever the solution is, which of course is the bread and butter of any working with any B2B company. It's always what their clients can say about working with them. And not only was the ROI good or great, did it happen in a reasonable amount of time? Was it fair? Did it happen fairly recently? Because like, yeah, we have this great client. They've been with us, and they saw that initial ROI like 2 years ago. Once again,
Mhm.
it's a little stale. And then of course the most important thing is, will they go on record to talk about it, or at the least be mentioned or be named in an article? Because ideally you want the reporter, whichever reporter you get interested in that case study story, to talk to them, not your
Yeah.
client, so they can sing their praises. But if the client's not on board, it could get frustrating and tricky, and it's something particularly it happens a lot in fintech, since most of the time the client is most client end users are banks and lenders and so forth, and for a variety of reasons, both letting their legal team speak for them, and just for fears of competitive intelligence, they just don't want to go on the record about anything, in that regards, especially with a cool fintech that they're using. Or in some cases, I remember there was a case I was working with a company involved, if you're familiar with the chargeback space, that was doing
Yes.
really cool things. Right. It was doing really cool things in the chargeback space and
Mhm.
working with big banks and, credit card rails, all the really big brands.
Yeah.
They wouldn't go on record at all, because the last thing they wanted their consumer population to know was that they're working with this really cool fintech that helps make the chargeback process more difficult for
Yep.
consumers. So, but in reality, it did. But in reality, that wasn't the case. It wasn't like some sort of purposeful, like we're trying to stop, because there's always legitimate chargebacks. We're not trying to stop
Yes.
all chargebacks. They were really using the company to prevent fraud. Which, because or in a lot of cases, friendly fraud, when people put chargebacks in for things that don't deserve a chargeback because the modifier or the description in the bill, is not accurate. It's like, oh, I didn't buy that. What company is this? Which is a
Mhm.
whole other story. That was something, but this was something the company was tackling. So I was able to take those narratives and push them out to their target audience, which of course were the banks and the rails. So it meant a lot of B2B pitching to a lot of fintech and finance publications
Yeah.
and podcast interviews to talk about, that we're really not the bad guys here. We're not out to get consumers. We're
Yeah.
out to help to help credit cards, lenders, and all that mitigate credit cards mitigate chargeback losses for
Yeah.
things that aren't chargeback or sometimes straight up fraud. So because it was focusing on the positive and what this technology can do for these end users, was able to get a lot of interest despite the lack of case studies.
Wow, 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 wow. So spoken like a true PR person in that you took something and you were able to make something great out of it. Even if it was too early or too late by the time it
Exactly.
gets in your hands. I love that. All right. So we spoke a little bit about this earlier in terms of budget versus readiness. A lot of early stage companies are bootstrap or fresh off of fundraising, right? How should startups really balance budget realities with PR readiness in your view?
I think when it's at that stage, I think they really have to, they have to take both into account. And and what I tell people, like when it's too early on, like I said, the early stage one, when it's too early on, even if they might have money or they might be or they think they're ready and they're not, that one's kind of easy to spot and easy to sort of talk them down the ledge, and they appreciate it. And most often they appreciate that. Where it gets a little trickier, is I find what you're saying is that sort of next stage where they're sort of between seed round and Series A, where they
Mhm.
start growing more and the burn rate becomes less and less of a worry, and they have more revenue coming in, and the pillars of growth of scaling and growth start kicking in,
Yeah.
and it's trying to determine, and they're seeing that they're increasing their marketing budget, or at that point they might have even hired their first in-house marketing person, or if they already had one, they expanded the team. So they're already putting more money into, or more time and development into some sort of marketing campaign initiatives, having it be a crucial part instead of it being another hat that the founder or founders used to have to wear a couple years prior. So I find it's usually at that part where I advise them to really see if the budget's there, and if part of that budget can be allotted to working with a PR agency, vis-a-vis how you see those current marketing efforts are doing, honestly.
Mm.
Because I find with some of these startups, they're, at that point, they may, like I said, they have some of these roots established. They
Yeah.
already have campaigns going out, but maybe some campaigns that initially worked the prior year when they got started with their new team or new marketing person or whatever work, but aren't working quite as well. Or, maybe they've gotten, well, in tandem, they've gotten the occasional article coverage or something on a podcast or something happened, but it was all inbound, and then it came and then it went, and maybe they didn't merchandise it around the way they should have. Maybe they just posted in their press page, but that was it, and it sort of came and went. And long story short, they're getting to the point where even though they're making this proactive effort, and it could be the first time in in the company's lifespan where they're really have the budget and the people power to make, to actually make these things happen on the marketing PR side, they're not quite seeing the results they're hoping for. Or like I said, they got it and it's
Yeah.
just going down, or it's sort of flatlining. And that's where I find is the perfect time to sort of have them come to terms with their fear and desire of what they want to achieve, how they want to raise the brand awareness of the company versus what they're willing to allocate with their funds to make that happen. And that's where I usually find is the sweet spot, when they do realize that, when they realize they can make it happen, and that they could work with an agency like mine where, I'm not free, but I'm not going to break your entire marketing budget either by hiring level PR. And they come to terms with that, and they want to work with somebody who's experienced, ready to go, and can
Mhm.
hit the ground running, and could really help those those brand awareness efforts to turbocharge whatever it is they're already doing or future marketing campaigns they're planning.
I love that so much. Is there a lean or phased approach that still makes an impact? This is a question that, even I, and having my own agency for the past 5 years, kind of struggle with. Is there a better one of the two, or is it neither? That lean or a phased approach for getting that impact for this specific type of startup and where they're at in terms of their business journey.
Gotcha. I'd say I'd say for most of the startups I end up working with, typically they're a little bit further back from the scenario I just gave. So so what that means, and often is the startups I'm working with have little to no brand awareness, or if
Mm,
they do, they might have had moments of it, but it hasn't been sustained. So I find at that point, other than maybe certain tactics like going hard on like speaking in awards and things
yeah,
like that where the founder just doesn't have that type of experience because that's what conference organizers always want. Have they spoken at this and that, what they speak about, the video, the show, etc.
yeah,
If that's not there, that's something you build up over time. Or if that's not there, or if they're not really that well known yet, and unless it's like a smaller conference, other than focusing on certain things like that, which I usually could do later for these founders, the main thing is that their founder name and their brand and their company name, there really is no brand awareness. So other than some more advanced tactics like that, I usually just sort of go all in, according with the scope of work aligning accordingly with the budget as well.
yeah,
So, and that usually means, going in on the soft stuff, trying to get the founder story out there, trying to get the company story out there, getting hard news out there if it's there, getting the case studies, and so on and so forth. And then, depending on the budget and where they are at a given time working with me, what also makes the most sense. So sometimes it's just the realities of the current moment, like, oh yeah, we just signed this client, but we can't really talk about it yet. It's just nothing to talk about. They don't have any ROI yet, so it's something we can put on the
mm,
side for later. So that just organically happens, and we won't focus on that yet. Whereas in the
yeah.
meantime, we could focus on something else.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like you found a really good mix and balance between the two. In some cases, it does have that lean campaign strategic approach, and then
Mhm.
others, it's kind of there's some aspects of kind of the phase, right, where you guys aren't quite ready for South by Southwest, for example, but
Mhm.
you're ready for a podcast, so phasing and adding more as this brand continues to work with y'all. I think that's awesome. I think a hybrid approach is a good approach when you're dealing with these types of startups. All right, so let's talk a little bit about PR as strategy and not as a sprint. How do you approach startups that see PR as just a quick win, or it's a band aid to a crisis situation they had instead of a long term real strategy? How do you approach it?
That one that's a tough one. It's never easy to convince them. At startups, as we know, it's hasn't been easy to convince much larger established companies
Yep.
about uh, about doing something like that. And I think once again it comes down to value, is establishing early on where the value is of working with people like us, working with agencies like ours, and why it's not only important and how it can ultimately help the bottom line, ultimately help your sales and marketing, but also the value in keeping it going. And I guess when I have those conversations, I try to explain that um, I always remember sort of the spigot theory in the sense that it can be sometimes it can be easy can be easy to turn on the spigot sometimes, but the water's not always flowing gushing out right away. It does take a little bit of time to get things going, but then once you get that momentum and once you've been I find usually by month 3 or 4, that's when if you got the momentum and things are just start going like clockwork, and you're getting certain opportunities are coming in per month, certain clips are coming in per month. By then you could tell. I find that I try to explain to them that it's much harder than once you've hit that inflection point to suddenly shut the spigot off and now no water's coming out because you felt you just needed for that moment, for that like the crisis scenario you mentioned, or just for that once again that funding news. There's that moment and we got what we needed and we're good now, and then just shut it off, and then wonder how come the awareness is not there like 6 months later when there's been no proactive communications, proactive publicity done on their behalf. It becomes then much harder to turn it back on. And that's sort of the warning I give to them. And it's not a threat, and it's not saying like, you have to keep paying me,
Yeah.
otherwise that's it. But it is one of those things when you have the momentum, you want to keep it going because, like we said prior, you can then build on that and build on more, get you into more speaking opportunities, more award stuff. Oh, we're doing podcasts now. You might qualify now. Maybe we could get you on a TV broadcast thing. Maybe you have a long enough sizzle reel at this point of your various interviews and things. You have this momentum. We have this, if you will, lawyer use, you have this evidence of of your thought leadership here and there and op-eds,
Hmm.
etc. So suddenly, and you just keep building on that and building on that. And I warn them it's really hard to build that back up when you shut things off and then you know want to then, because inevitably you're going to want to start it up again. Because I also find that once companies and founders, get positive PR, they like anything else, some of them could get kind of addicted to it, and they,
Yeah.
they want more of it,
Yeah.
and it's just not so easy to do that when you just go from start to stop or just use it a little bit here and there, which is what I recommend. If it is, now I do understand there's of course financial realities, and if something does come up where they can't afford working with me at the same rate or whatever the scope of work was, I then try to press upon them to consider the alternative instead of not going for the, shut the spigot off. Let's at
Mm.
least keep the water dripping. Just say, okay, so we won't focus so much on these different campaigns. We'll just focus more
Mm.
on X and Y instead of A and B, and it can be precarious when you lower retainers, and I'm not going to go into that. That's a separate discussion
Yeah.
because it's hard to raise them back up. But I always found there's a better, if possible, to just keep the lifeline going, and not even just for finance, for my sales or my finance, but just to make sure that you're still getting some sort of messaging out there in a proactive and a positive way, rather than having to start all over again down the road.
Yeah, yeah, I really like that illustration. I think it's a perfect way to really encapsulate what it means to have active PR going and not just shutting it down every time, you have one great opportunity and then we stop. And then we have another great opportunity and then we stop. Like keeping that drip going, it means so much in the long run in terms of that particular client's overall PR branding and image awareness, right? So I think some of that too is setting the expectation early, right?
Mm,
And when I can say even for me, when I started the agency back in 2020, I had some really awesome mentors that would always make it be known, like, you want to over deliver, don't under. And I know there's a better quote for that. But what kind of expectation setting happens in those first client calls for you, where you're just kind of setting, okay, I'm not saying you're getting New York Times in 2 days. I'm not saying that. Because I
yeah.
know there are some out there. I know you see the ads too, where they're like, "Hey, we can get you media in 30 seconds." And I'm like, "How, Sway? There's no way." So, it's mind-boggling to see that people still do this, but it is still being done. So what kind of expectation settings do you have, and what happens, in those first client calls to really set the stage? I think ethically, personally, I think ethically.
No, we're speaking the same language. Under promise, over deliver. Um, I'd say I try to set those expectations as early as possible, even before those first kickoff calls and initial weeks. I try to set it during the proposal stage, like,
Mm,
here's a page in my deck or whatever that, my proposal that says, sample targets and so forth.
mm,
But I just say sample. It doesn't mean these are the only targets, and I try to mix it up as much as possible between ones that might be a little more pie in the sky, like Fortune, versus that trade publication, which will most likely cover you right, initially.
yep.
Things like that. Try to set the balance, and it does come up even in the proposal stage. Like there's still this. What's a nice way to put it? Fossilized? Well, that's not so nice, but there's still an older expectation mindset from, I guess, a different generation. One that I think I saw even a lot more when I first started back
Mhm,
in around like 99, 2000, which
mhm.
was, you know, what placements can you guarantee, or how many or more concerned about quantity, not the quality.
Mm,
And sort
yeah.
of strike that balance even early on in proposal stage, and then I take it to the next level and flesh it out more once the kickoff call comes, and then strategy docs, etc. Is setting that balance of not making any guarantees. There's no guarantees. Even the
Mhm.
best laid plans might not lead to you getting, the number one outlet that you really wanted this to be in the most, in the first, or for this news, or whatever the campaign is.
Yeah.
But I try to set the expectations of, most likely this is if it's like specifically, if it's a specific hard news, most likely this is, I could see this getting into, like, I give ranges, like, maybe,
Yeah.
5 to 10 clips. And then even then I quantify it with, which could be a variety of articles, brief mentions, Q&As, et cetera, et cetera. And then I make it even, I wouldn't say vaguer, but I make it even more expansive
Mm,
when it's not a specific hard news. It's just generally speaking, because they'll come up like, what do you think, what number of clips do you get for us in general over X amount of months? And it's like, so without having to pretend to look into a crystal ball, I usually give I usually give ranges, quantify them by, this could be a variety of different types of opportunities. It doesn't mean, like, if I say 6 to 10, doesn't mean that's 6 to 10, online articles. Could be a podcast in there. Could be a mention, like I said, could be mentioned. Could be a
mhm.
good old listicle, depending. Of course,
Yeah.
that depends on, the client or the would-be client. And when I find I do that in a proposal, it sort of carries on that expectation. I'm able to carry that expectation on into actually working with the client and setting them accordingly in the strategy, so that they know that we're not, so that they know that this is what I feel is realistic. I'm
Mhm.
not promising the moon and the stars. There's no guarantees, but this is what I feel could be doable. And it also gives me the option to open it up and say, and these are the various, outlets I think that, and reporters that I think could be interested in XYZ stories, and so forth, so that we also don't make the mistake of getting locked into not just the number or the amount, but the types of outlets and the types of reporters, and that there are other opportunities out there that they probably didn't think about, because they're not experts. That's why they're coming to us.
You're exactly right. Yeah, I think that is so, so, so spot on what you said about creating those sample targets and just kind of like setting the stage. This is what we think realistically can happen here. But those that are familiar, there's no guarantees in PR because we don't control the media. They're a whole separate entity, right? So we
Mm-hmm.
can pitch, we can share, we can provide the news and that information, but it's really ultimately up to them. That's what keeps this, I don't want to say neutral, but I think it keeps it fair, right? Because if that was the case, we would just be bought. And then if you're just being bought to place media, then what is that? That's an ad. And that's not
Yeah,
what people are here for. We want real,
and
authentic storytelling.
yeah, and that could be a part of, if they could afford it. That could be a
Yeah.
part. That could be just another part of
Yeah.
the scope of work that, my agency or other agencies could help these companies with, if they want to invest in that. But ultimately, balancing out with earned media, with earned media, and the media, the content that they own, et cetera, et cetera. It's usually the best bet. And, once, of course, if they can afford that paid aspect. And sometimes, and I find that lately, I find that does come up on occasion for my startups, because, in a sense,
Mm.
they can't typically afford, to go full in on, the full pay for play, big spreads, or whatever you see in a digital magazine, or what have you. But what they can afford, and I've seen come up lately, and it's just more of a media trend, is where it's like, there was I got an op-ed placed for a client recently in a targeted publication, and to help, and it wasn't pay for play, but they offer an option to expedite the article, have it go up sooner, and to not wait the 6-week queue for like a nominal fee of $80. So for that startup, and I think others would agree that that's okay. That's something that's fine. That's something you could put on your invoice, mark up accordingly depending on how you do it as an agency. And then it's usually a hit that even at this stage, most startup founders could handle and actually be happy with, because we still got access in the earned way. It's just really just more of a fee expedite it to get it out sooner. In this case, it was before clients' upcoming conference, so it was more timely, something they could show at their booth. So it made sense from the timeline perspective. And from an ethical, moral stance, they don't, and I don't seem to mind it because in this case, as they put it, this is just a small fee we offer to help sort of keep the lights on in this outlet. And if provided that the person, the editor, I was in touch with is saying the truth, telling me the truth, then that's fine. So I'm finding that that's happening a lot more, and founders are much more amenable to that because it's usually fairly reasonable. It's when it goes over and they're offering that more traditional pay-to-play stuff, and it starts getting into four figures and five figures, and I'm like, no, this is not just to keep the lights on. This is going for the ad money.
Oh, yes, yes. Well, let's talk a little bit about entering the US market. All right. So you mentioned earlier that international startups often face extra layers of complexity. Can you share just what some of those challenges are, those extra layers that they kind of have to deal with?
Well, I think overall the extra challenge they usually have. Well, I found, because I've done a lot of work with international startups, I found the biggest, they all want to come here. That's first and foremost, and for obvious reasons. The market's so much bigger, even if they've had success in Europe or Asia Pacific, etc. It's still this is still the prize, America,
Yeah.
or North America. We'll expand it with Canada and Mexico. Either or, it's still the prize. But they all want it, but I find a lot of the challenges a lot of them are dealing with is, but also back to the expectations, might be less on maybe less about the particulars of how much coverage we get, how many, what we were talking about before, and more about thinking that they're at the right time where they could get that kind of coverage that they want. AKA the common mistake being, we're XYZ company and wherever in Europe, this and that. And now we're in America. This is newsworthy. Cover us. It's no, it's just usually typically doesn't work that way, because especially if they're not even that well known in their home country or home region. It's one thing. Like, for example, I'm just thinking of a good example where it actually did make sense. I was doing a funding round not terribly long ago for a company that already had made great strides, already reached certain milestones in their home country. I believe it was India, and it was in the energy space and so forth. And it was a funding round, but they were also wanting to use it as an excuse to talk about the cool stuff they were doing in America. But unlike just announcing, oh, we got this funding and we're here in America, cover us, it was like, no, we're here in America, but we've been here. We already had this this like a manufacturing plant out in Spokane or wherever it was, somewhere on the West Coast, and we're producing XYZ kilowatts and et cetera. And they did it the right way, and I was able to utilize it and leverage it the right way to get the coverage they wanted, because they already had, not only was it just we're here, but we're here and we're doing something that's already impactful to our clients, and so on and so forth, without having to go into who their American clients are. Now I think about it, I don't know if they even had it, but the clients that mentioned, but that was a case where it didn't matter because they're beyond just being here. They're being here and they're already achieving XYZ. So that's a great example of when it could work, but most of the time that isn't the case. So when I talk to international companies, I try to explain to them, have you built an established presence in your home country or home region? Have you had early funding success? Have you, hired multiple rounds of hiring? How's the company's growth? How's the revenue? You could talk about. Have you had open up satellite offices in other areas and you see growth in those other areas as well? And now it's like, oh, America's the last beachhead to conquer. Does it make sense? It doesn't make sense from your growth perspective that coming to America now. And then and then with that, have they had, along those milestones, have they had media coverage in their home regions? Have they been covered? Do they have brand awareness elsewhere and so forth? So that when it is time to then pitch it to American journalists, some of them might be like, oh, wait a minute, I think I've heard of these guys, or like, that
Oh,
sound familiar. Yeah, didn't they just have that big whatever? Not like, who, what, where, what, so there's a
yeah.
chance it's it's not completely pitching to a excuse me, completely pitching to a blank wall, and that there's clients, that there's clients over there from their region that can talk positively about what they're doing, and maybe even some in America, like, or announce that, they want to announce that they're in America, but maybe they wait a little bit because it's not just the one dude in a sales office at a WeWork. It's they took a little time. They took a couple months or half a year, have you, and they could have a client, already singing their praises in the States. That's crucial,
Mm,
especially that reporters know, because Sarah mentioned, yeah, we have the largest like mint tea provider in Turkmenistan. Um, okay, who's that? What? No, don't care. American reporters are, gonna be, America centric. It's
mm,
that's a tough pill for a lot of international founders to swallow. It's just,
yeah.
yeah, it just is what it is, and it's not even political. It's just, it's just,
Yeah.
how they expect consumers over here. Some, yes, some do care about foreign news, but a lot of Americans don't. So they're going to take that perspective, even on the B2B trade side. We're talking here.
Mm,
Like I said, I'm not even talking, stuff that's bigger, higher up the food chain.
yeah.
So that's important. And then of course, how that what then of course the thing that's also crucial is the same thing that's crucial to, American-based startup founders, is what is their product and service doing? Solve
Yeah.
whatever pain point. Is it unique? Is it different than what's in the market? But the onus is on them to prove that even more so, because they're likely entering a market where there's already a lot of established American-based companies there. Okay, so what are you doing that's so different that their clients would want to switch to some foreign company they never heard of?
Mm,
So
mm,
it sort of raises the bar even higher for them to prove, uh, when when thinking about coming over here and thinking about trying to make publicity, hey, that they're coming over here or they're already over here. So those are the things that I think they really have to consider. Also partnerships too with key American brands, that, business partners that are recognizable to the media and ultimately to end user customers. I think that's important as well. And
mhm,
if you have a bunch of if you're able to check off the boxes of everything I just said, or at least most of what I just said,
mhm.
you might have a shot, and you have a shot to launch your brand awareness initiatives via, communications and positive PR in the best way. But if you don't, I usually recommend that you wait a bit until until the company's further along, because it's just it's going to be much harder for people like ourselves to get those kind of stories out when they're just not there, or maybe they will be there, but the stories are being written in real time. And until then, it's just, they have the guy in the sales office in the WeWork, and that's
Yes, yes. Well, hey, that sounds like a lot of layers. Definitely a lot of complexities there when those international founders and startups are coming to the US market and wanting to just expand. And you touched on this so perfectly, which kind of leads me to my next question about how many of them have this attitude of, well, I'm entering the US market. That is the story. And it's like, yeah, no, you need a little bit more than that. So, what's the biggest mistake you see international founders make when trying to build US brand awareness? Because that was just one that you kind of touched on there. It's the
a lot.
assumption.
I'm sorry, you're saying.
Oh, yeah, yeah, no, I was just saying like that assumption that, okay, that is the story. I'm here. And it's like, no, no, we did a little bit more than that.
No, exactly. I think it's like I said, you're not, yeah, I listed a lot of different check boxes to check, and realistically, even if a company might be ready, they might not check off every box. So
Yeah.
I think sort of the common ground of the key consideration, I would say, is that there is some sort of U.S. centric link there, something you could point to. Like I said, it could be, we're now entering the market. Like the partnership's a great example. We're now in the market, and in a fintech, we're partnering with like Chase or something. So at
Mhm.
least it shows that, yeah, we might not have 1 million customers yet, and not everyone's using our neobank as much as they are in
Yeah.
Slovenia. But, we already partnered with Chase to be their new international fintech to offer this neobank to what we feel is an emerging market of Slovenian expats who are moving in record rates, et cetera. You know, so
Yeah.
something, something like that, whether you could really tie it to momentum and also tie it to a trend that's happening in their particular industry. So I think that's a great example of something that could help go beyond just the fact that we're here. Or in some cases, I've had it where it wasn't even like a startup. It was like something, I believe, a client coming to me with like an event they're having, and the event was so centric to their industry and their respective country that there's just no way an American journalist, even like and even journalists in their respective trade, would cover it without some sort of connection. And I'm like, and it doesn't have to be in. And yes, the conference is not in America, so you can't switch that up. It's in your home country, but there's got to be something to draw it in. And their answer was, well, it's because we want more American customers in this industry to just pay attention to this. And that's the American connection. I'm like, no, that's not enough. Like, do you have any interesting speakers at your conference who are American or high up in your industry that people and journalists in your industry would know if they say, oh, XYZ CEO of Super Energy Corp is speaking at the whatever trade fair, and in August or so forth, and he's going to be speaking on an interesting relative, an interesting trade topic that's hot right now. If you have something like that, that's where you could find that American connection, even though none of this is taking place in America. But they couldn't offer that, so I'm like, this would just, so I passed on it. This is just going to be spinning wheels, and it's just at the end, everyone's just going to get upset and frustrated.
Yes, yes. Well, definitely. That is some incredible, incredible insight. But all of this, I think, is so, so helpful for those folks that are considering, entering the US market. These are things that you should be aware of and should really, really be cognizant of when you're building out your strategy and your plan, and really determining who all is going to help support you in that too, and just
Mm.
how you need to do this. But definitely there's a lot of mistakes and fails that I'm hearing, that it's just like, oh yeah, that's just almost even a cultural awareness piece that you have to consider and include when you're entering in a market that is not your own and what you're familiar with. There's got to be a cultural awareness piece, because you got to be able to attract people and speak their language where they're at, not what you're used to, but where they're at. And that goes into almost analytics and data. That goes into
Mhm.
the research piece that you mentioned earlier. That is such an important piece that no founder can miss out on. You have to have that in there. You got to know your audience at the end of the day. You got to.
Yeah.
So, all right, cool, cool. So let's talk a little bit about the PR forecast, right? Before we wrap up 2025 and beyond. So, what advice would you give to startup founders listening today who are on the fence about PR?
I would tell them to, A, if you're thinking about it, it's a good thing. Even if you're not ready to pull the trigger to work with anybody, it means that along the lines of what I said earlier, something's, I won't say something's wrong, but something's like a little bit off, or it feels like there could be more that could be done to raise the brand awareness, to get the name out there more, to get their founder's name out there more. And it's just not whatever, because every situation is different, whatever the current situation is, or the current initiatives, whether it be none at all or some happening on the marketing side, like whatever is happening it's just not pushing the needle enough. And they might not be able to pinpoint exactly what it is, but there's sort of that gut feeling that I need a little help, or I just need a way to push this forward, a bit more or a lot more, depending, or I know, or sometimes the evidence is there. Like, I know, like, we had this news announcement. I know we could have gotten more. How come we didn't? But it's not always going to be that, it's not going to be that, that evident. It's not always going to be so obvious. So that's why I would say, look, see what your gut's telling you, and see what the return you're getting on whatever marketing and sales initiatives you're currently implementing. and and if that feeling still lingers, and moreover, you keep seeing in the news that you read that's related to your industry and your company, that your main competitor or competitors keep ending up in the press and you're not, then maybe your gut was right. Maybe how come my company's not there? How come my name's not there? What are we doing wrong? What's missing? Then might be your gut telling you that it is time to, if not, sign up with a PR agency, at least maybe start investigating and looking into it.
Very good advice. So, what trends are you seeing in tech PR right now, particularly around startup engagement?
I would say it's still something that's continued. The previous couple of years is still AI is still super hot, and AI
On
AI
fire.
anything AI anything. I will say though that now that it's been a couple years since the Chat GPT revolution exploded onto the scene, which I believe was 2023,
Yeah.
formally, I guess.
Yeah.
Because AI, machine learning, and deep learning have been around long before then, but when it
Yeah.
became, took over, if you will, I think the trend I'm seeing is that reporters are, especially those who really cover this day in and day out, are getting much more savvy about what's actual innovation in AI versus what's just like, oh no, like, we're just this plus AI. It's like that old thing, like, well, we built a new radio. How's it different from the old radio? Well, we added a shower nozzle to it, so now you can shower with it, but it's still a radio, right? Yeah, so it's sort of like that, those lines where
Uh,
it's just like, is it really just like, is this really that innovative? Is this really, moving the needle forward, or, can you get the attention of the big dog like NVIDIA and the big chat
yeah.
GPTs of the world, to be at that level? Because they, typically I've seen they do suck up most of the air in the AI room conversation. It's so being able to just tack on AI to anything, I don't think is really working anymore. And you got to show sort of the bona fides, maybe not proof of like revenue and this and all these milestones, but they have to show that what they're doing, once again, differentiation, what they're doing really is different, or is the AI something that they actually developed and is unique and is bringing something to the table, as opposed to just white labeling one of these many other corporate options that are available.
Mhm.
So I think that's something that the media is much more keen with, and paying attention to.
So tech media is getting more specific. They want to know the details, but they also want to see that there is real innovation happening here. So no more fluff. The fluff
Hmm.
might have worked in the past, but not so much now. Now,
I
especially
would
with machine learning and tools.
I wouldn't even say fluff so much. I guess the better way to put it maybe would
Yeah.
be, no easy pass, in the sense that maybe a year or
Ah,
two ago you could have just added on AI and say you're AI, and that would, there's going to
no.
be automatic interest now. That no.
I see. I see. Okay. Okay. That definitely makes sense. Are there any emerging best practices that startup founders should be aware of as they scale up?
Um, Best practice. I guess best practices. Yeah, I'd say just from my own personal experience, no matter, it might not be the people you'll be working with forever as your company grows and grows, but always make sure to don't treat your vendors just as vendors. Try to treat them as partners, because even if you end up working with someone like myself for a couple years, but then like ultimately we're too big, we need a bigger agency or this, it happens. I understand, that's
Yeah.
fine. But if you end up treating your partners like partners, and you really value who they are and what they do and what the services that they're providing, it will just set up that mindset for any other future larger partners you may be working with as your company grows. And just generally just knowing how to treat people the right way, because ultimately that's what it comes down to.
Mm. That's what it comes down to. You're so right. Well, Scott, this was such a valuable conversation. I think so many startups, especially those navigating PR for the first time, will really walk away from this with so much more clarity and confidence about what the right timing looks like for them. So, for those that are interested in getting connected with you, how can they find out more?
Certainly. So, the two, I guess, best bets are my website, www.levelpr.co, and that's for Level PR. My email, if you want to just go directly to me is scott@levelpr.co. I'm also listed on LinkedIn. I believe my LinkedIn, I can't remember it right now, but it might just be like LinkedIn profile, Scott Rosenblum. And if you look up Scott Rosenblum, there's only so many of us who are PR folks. I believe I'm competing with some lawyer in Missouri or something. That's not me, so you could find me there as well. And a side note, since we spoke so in depth about the challenges of international startups coming here, if this is being heard by any international startup founders, if you go to my website, levelpr.co, you'll find a section that talks exactly about this. That's all about international PR and goes over the things that more depth about what I mentioned, and the challenges and the bars that you have to face when coming to America. And part of that page on the website, there's a form where they could fill it out and get a free ebook all about international PR.
Nice. I love a good freebie. All right. So, for anyone interested in learning more about Scott's work or Level PR, check out www.levelpr.co. And of course, we'll drop the link in the show notes. Don't forget to subscribe to the Branding PR podcast wherever you get your podcasts. If you love today's episode, leave a review and share with a founder or marketeer who needs to hear this. Until next time, I'm Brandi Sims, and remember, every brand has a story. Let's make sure yours is heard. Thanks, Scott.
Thank you, Brandi.